I am Piers Ridyard, CEO of the decentralized finance protocol Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. This is our podcast, The DeFi Download, a show about decentralized finance and all things crypto, where we dive into the details of the projects, assets, and services that are powering the DeFi revolution. Today, I'm joined by Do Kwon, co-founder of Terra, a layer 1 protocol and stablecoin with the aim of solving problems in finance better than existing FinTech solutions. The Terra ecosystem is made up of many products, including Luna, an elastic supply token with a market cap of $7.4 billion, Chai, a popular consumer payments application that is now used by over 5% of Koreans, Anchor, a lending protocol that pays out 20% per annum on savings in Terra stablecoins, and Mirror, a decentralized version of Robinhood where you can trade any kinds of synthetic equity, to name but a few. Do Kwon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
So what would be really great, and it's actually rare that I do this with people who come on the show, but I think that it's actually very relevant, is if you could just give a bit of background of what you did before you started Terra, and then what the reason that you decided that Terra was a necessary thing to build as a result of that experience prior to Terra.
Yeah, so I was a previous student. Not so much that I got really good grades, but I was very ambitious and basically worked my ass off for no reason at all. So definitely sort of like workaholic vibes. So I ended up graduating, Stanford in 3 years with like a double major. And then when I got my first job, I was very excited to do, to create lots of impact. So my first job out of college was at Microsoft. And then I ended up working for a team that, had something to do with the NLP. But the interesting thing is the dynamic of how people worked when I first started working there was actually pretty interesting because, I ended up realizing that at big companies, very few people actually do work.
Right.
And then you can get past by doing very little work.
Right.
So what would look like maybe like one school assignment back in school, people stretch that out over like 6 months. Right. And then a lot of these wouldn't reach production and people would be perfectly fine with it.
Right.
So it was basically an environment where people are like doing very little work and I was hungry to get lots of problems. But like initially I could see that the work that was being given to me wasn't really relevant to creating lots of impact. So I started to tinker with some side projects until I developed a pretty interesting technology whereby you could connect mobile phones and desktops together to create a Wi-Fi mesh network. Mm-hmm. The idea behind that POC was even if you don't have direct internet connection, like let's say LTE or Wi-Fi, you could connect through a network of other people around you
right.
to get internet connection.
Right. A bit like Fireside Chat or Fire Chat.
Yeah. So that was the idea. So for Fire Chat, you could only send messages to each other
right.
via a mesh network, but this was, full out internet connection.
Right.
So you can think about it as multi-layered Wi-Fi tethering.
Right.
And that was kind of a different market, right? Like LTE, there was limits to how much it had rolled out. It was difficult to get Wi-Fi access in lots of different places. So business models like Boingo that was targeting large venues and enterprises to offer Wi-Fi solutions. So, I ended up, making a company out of that and then got together a few of my friends from school to create that into a company called Anyfi. And then we sold B2B full stack solutions to offer network services to large venues like airports, amusement parks. So, for example, our first customer was a place called Everland Park, which was one of the largest amusement parks in Asia, with about anywhere between 8 to 10 million annual visitors. So they really had like a need of being able to produce, seamless internet connection to lots of visitors without wanting to invest, tens of millions of dollars in a Wi-Fi backhaul. So did that for a while, and then you can imagine as you are typing in Google search queries for distributed networks, you would not only see a lot of search results for Wi-Fi mesh, yep. but you would also see a lot of search results for, let's say, Bitcoin.
Right.
So I sort of got casually interested in investing into the crypto ecosystems through adjacent research areas. And then, like back in, I would say like end of 2016 or so, a friend of mine pulled me into this Facebook chat room with about 8 people. And then they were all talking about like projects like Monero, like Ethereum, and the quality of that conversation was, significantly higher than what you would find on a normal Reddit.
Right.
So I started engaging with that community a lot more, and then that ended up turning into like a Discord server, like more than 200 people, talking about different projects. Some of them like ended up launching projects, from that group and things like that. And then I started to notice that a lot of the crypto projects that were launching were so terrible,
right?
Or not so terrible per se, but like what they were promising was so far ahead what was actually going to get built,
right,
or what the technology could actually do, that I decided to jump in full time and start Terra towards the end of 2017.
And so the Terra like idea, like, and I've seen this in talks that you've given where you, or like presentations you've made, where I see a lot of similarity with the way that you think about building companies, in the way that sort of like Paul Graham teaches at Y Combinator, with this sort of like attitude towards build things that fundamentally have a use or a value, rather than sort of build things for technology's sake. Like, it sounds like your experiences at Microsoft have also shaped a sort of an attitude towards doing, that has sort of like, as a result, ended up creating all of these different arms or products that exist in the Terra ecosystem. Was the vision of Terra as broad as it is today, or did it start off just being like stable value tokens are going to be an interesting or useful thing? What was the nexus of this is the first thing that I need to build, and this is why, and why your own network as well?
That's a lot of adjacent questions, but I think the answers to all of those things is yes and no. So like the primary motivation that we had when starting Terra was, at the end of the day, like the first thing that's going to make a lot of sense in crypto is something that brings, the first 100 million or the first billion users to crypto, right? So usership was going to be the most important thing, because if you have a technology that is so new, you could technically create like a complicated AI algorithm that services the military extremely well, and that could create, billions and billions of dollars in value. Mm-hmm. Similar to how you could create a crypto protocol that a set of asset managers in crypto would find extremely useful, and that could be worth a lot of money. But I think in terms of like historical significance, it was important to have some sort of set of protocols or really core products that the mainstream user could really empathize with and use on a day-to-day basis. And that's sort of what we wanted to do at Terra. So when we were first starting out the protocol, like the stablecoin was interesting, but it was only interesting to the extent that there would be features that are built on top of it that would make it easier to spend and more attractive to hold compared to fiat currency or Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what we're executing on today. Like Anchor Protocol makes Terra stablecoins more attractive to hold, mm-hmm, by offering a source of yield that is more stable and attractive than anything you can find in a commercial bank. Mirror Protocol allows you to access, like a world of different asset classes that you couldn't do it depending on which geography or jurisdiction that you might be based in. And our payment entities just make the gains from all those things extremely easy to spend in day-to-day payments.
And in terms of like decentralized finance and that being a thing that sort of grew out of it's been lurking in the background for a long time, but it's really only come to the fore in the last year or so. How did that emergence change your strategy, if it did change your strategy in any way?
Yeah, so a number of different things. So with the rise of DeFi protocols last summer, we've started to experiment with fair launches for protocols that are being built on top of the Terra network. So for example, the Mirror protocol is something that we launched. We issued governance tokens for, which has full control of everything that's going on in the protocol. And we just gave those tokens away to everybody but us. And the Anchor protocol in some sense was very similar, where we held like a initial auction using our own airdrop supply in the beginning. And then that ended up like, most of the tokens being bought out by other people. So after trying several of these different launches, I think the community really appreciates, like, even if it's not for monetary value's sake, and even if the inflation rate is really high, They want to get to a state where they own significant chunks of the products that they're using on a day-to-day basis. And that's been super interesting, right? So the idea that you can bootstrap usership and engagement through your protocols by, in some sense, like giving away future upside in the protocol to the people that are more invested in it from the very beginning. That was not a dimension that we first considered when launching Terra.
And all of these, I suppose, in the Terra ecosystem, all of these Chai, Mirror, Anchor, etc., have been built principally by the Terraform team, right? Or the Terra Labs team. And then subsequently launched. How do you see the slow moving over to people actually choosing to build on something like Terra and convincing a developer to come and build on the Terra platform versus on the Ethereum platform or on Binance SmartChain or any of the other sort of options? Like, there's so much you can do as an individual entity, even if you have a huge amount of budget, right? And then there's a certain point where the complexity of the system can only grow if external parties are choosing to build on it as well. So, like, how do you think about that aspect of it?
Yeah. So, we did build the first set of initial protocols like Anchor and Mirror and then Ozone and Nebula. But what that's managed to do, it's bootstrapped an enormous developer community around it. So there's even the ones that I'm aware now, there's like 100 different projects that are building unique products on top of Terra. And the reason why this becomes interesting is because, we have better primitives to build on top of Terra than lots of different other layer ones, right? So for example, if you have mirrored assets as like a base to build your protocols on, that is much better than using, let's say, the Pickle coin or some other sort of native crypto asset that has
Pickle is an amazing. Yeah, no, I like Pickle, but yes. Sorry, carry on.
Right. Oh, I forgot that was a real project.
It's a real project. Yes. No, it is real.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's say French fry coin. I wouldn't dare sully the honorable Pickle name, so let's say French fry coin.
Yeah.
But it's much easier to build on real assets, bring them on chain, and then to build different types of DeFi protocols on top of it. So, for example, like the ability to create options on top of real equities, such that you can take like 100x long, 100x short on Apple stock. It's much more useful, or at least has a much more approachable user base than doing it on a DeFi token with a limited set of users. And if you have something like, let's say, the 20% yield primitive on Anchor, then you can redirect this yield to unlock lots of different transactional paradigms. So for example, instead of having like a creator economy where a user pays the creator directly, you can stake your stablecoins to this creator such that he can benefit from your cash flow. You can even launch like ICOs or projects this way. So you've sort of started to see, branches of projects that are building on top of, let's say, Anchor or Mirror, or like Nebula, the ETF protocol, and then sort of start to interconnect with each other to create really interesting dynamics that we couldn't have foreseen that are, popping up in the ecosystem right now. And I dare say, even by the number of developers and the project understanding that I'm seeing in sort of private deals, we have, one of the largest and most exciting developer communities at this time.
That's really awesome. So I completely understand, and I think I agree with this idea of like there being a natural set of primitives that are necessary to build finance. And it's not just the ability to build code, but also the objects that matter. So, money being, I have this concept of the financial layer cake, where the bottom of the layer cake is money. Like if you don't have money or a form of stable asset that you can do clearance and settlement via, then people aren't going to be able to build more complicated things like options and derivatives and all that kind of stuff. And then there's then if you go up the layer cake, you have things like simple options like futures, which allow you to just take a position versus another asset, right? And then you can get more and more complicated beyond that. Interestingly, I always think of equity at very high in the layer cake, because equity isn't just an instrument. It's a bunch of governance stuff, and it's a bunch of rule sets that are actually really complicated about legally how a company acts in the world today. What is the point where you think, okay, we only need to build this suite of products, and then from that point forwards, it's up to the community? Or have you got, like, in your mind the next 3 years of additional, like, extra applications that you want to build in this, in the space as well to drive growth?
Yeah. So, to tackle sort of like the first question, I think we're living in a really interesting time. And I think this has only happened in the last 10 years or so, where we're starting to see companies sort of rival nation states in some dimensions, right? So, for example, like Apple and Amazon, there's no real way that an investor could buy a bunch of stock, even very large hedge funds, and try to take control of Apple. Like, that just doesn't really make sense. So really what people are buying into are stories, right? The idea that you can have well-designed consumer electronics that's going to, sort of enthrall the imagination of the world. With Amazon, can you store everything in a digital store, right? And with Tesla, can we have a version of humanity that doesn't pollute ourselves to death? So these are sort of narratives and stories that people are buying into, and it has massive appeal across the world. It's not only US citizens that would like to buy Tesla stock and Apple stock. It's basically everybody that has some sort of indirect exposure to these stories, right? But the limiting factor here is that not everybody can buy these different types of stories. And it's not even possible for anyone to build products on top of that. Right. And this is what Mirror enables, right? So, like, if you sort of start to go into the long tail of smaller companies that investors can buy out, and there's real chance of governance and things like that, I don't think Mirror would be the appropriate product. But it's for all types of equities that I think are telling stories that can vibe with a global audience, if that makes sense.
Okay, that does make sense. And in terms of, like, where the Terra expansion of product build stops and community starts, like, do you have an idea of what that inflection point is? Or is it you'll just keep, when you see opportunity that needs or a tool that needs building, you will go and build it, and you'll not go, there is no point where you'll go, actually, this is something that I want to wait and see if the community will build first before I step in and decide that this needs to be built?
Well, so the way that I'm thinking about it is pretty simple, right? So I like to build different types of products that I can sort of see enabling different types of products. So I think Mirror independently is interesting, but it's only really interesting because it can be used as primitives for other protocols like options and different things we built on top of this, right? Like, I think independently is marginally interesting. With everything that's possible, it can be much, much bigger. The second thing that I try to think about this is I'm a reasonably skilled developer that's working on 20 different things at the same time. So I'm pretty sure very soon we'll get to a state where, like, each marginal thing that I'm launching is significantly lower in quality than, let's say, the other top projects that are coming out of the Terra ecosystem. And I think that's the point where I can sort of stop shipping these things and then sort of go into, sort of support mode to enable different types of developers in the ecosystem. It's a really interesting dynamic, because I don't think a lot of, platforms in crypto have before spent a lot of time launching the first sort of landmark products on top of that.
I'm not sure that's true. I'll push back on that. So, like, Consensus at the start of Ethereum certainly did take that role. Like, MetaMask was Consensus's view on what was necessary to make a user experience even plausible for DeFi. I can't remember, Infura. It was a Consensus product, because they realized that developers were going to need to build their own nodes, and they needed an easy spin up node service. And then, like, Gnosis was a Consensus product, and there was a bunch of other stuff, Singularity, DTV, like, there was a bunch of stuff that they launched But they didn't launch it in the same way that you have. What they did is they kind of went, this would be a really good idea. Let's find a team that can build it, and then we'll make them as separate from us as possible. We'll just keep some equity stake, and we'll make a decentralized style company. And what often happened is you got these teams that didn't have like a overarching theory of what the ecosystem strategy was. They just had a specific product bent. Whereas what I can see with what you're doing with Terra is every single one of these products is much more about like, how does this interplay in the ecosystem, rather than like like, can this thing make money is less important than does this thing make the entire network more successful?
Exactly. Yeah. I would say it's a more focused version of consensus, like maybe what we do at Terraform Labs. Yeah.
Right. From the point of view of, it's interesting you mentioned the nation state thing. Like, governments, companies are now larger than nation states. I often think about layer one protocols as a little bit like founding a country. You have a country, you have a bunch of rules as to how that country operates. You have a bunch of beliefs around what that country has been established for. You want people to come and become citizens of your country, and you have currency of your country. How much do you think about the interaction or the potential interaction between nation states and protocols like Terra?
So I have, given a lot of this sort of involves forward projection, right? And then there's different case scenarios depending on how variables play out. So I can't say for sure. But one of the things that I think is imperative for models like this to succeed is if you plan to disappear at some point, right? So if you are a centralized institution and then you plan to keep on growing, nation states have a monopoly on this, or very big corporations that abide by the laws of the nation state. So in some sense, vassal vehicles. It only works if you have a standing army by which you can protect your borders and fight against other nation states. That's really the only way that this works. Right? Because anything of value in this world, you have to follow some sort of centralized governance that does have access to that type of violence, or it needs to be subservient to another, right? So I think the only way where we can launch a currency and for it to reach massive scale is if we plan to disappear at some point. And that's a topic that I think about a lot. So one of the reasons why, as we launch new things, actually, like every time that we launch something new, like Anchor or Mirror, it actually doesn't make the company any money. And then it costs lots of resources, which is why we've had to keep fundraising. But like we do these things because ultimately, like we understand that if you have a lot of valuable DeFi protocols on top of Terra, it's going to make the overall network more valuable. And number two, it's going to inspire the next generation of developers to jump onto the system and then to make the entire stack better from bottom to top. Right? That's it. And ultimately, the way that I see how we would fit in with nation states is that by the time that we get really big, that governments would want to shut us down, we would have done that voluntarily.
But in terms of things like, for example, the Korean won Terra coin, which is essentially a synthetic currency. It doesn't have any money in a bank account that is representing that money. Which I'm not saying is a negative thing at all. I think that synthetic money is a necessity for fast growth in these economies. But from a nation state's point of view, and you saw this to some extent with with the American government's mislike of the Facebook project, which has changed its name. I can't remember what its new name is. But DM, that's right. The Korean government's has the same things, like thinks about the same things, or the American government or the UK government thinks about the same things as we do when it comes to token economics, which is like, what's the velocity of the money in our system, and what are the sinks, the places in which that money stops and stays as a store of value, which in aggregate means that we have the ability to either print more money or borrow more or whatever. And if you create synthetic versions of a currency, you're no longer creating those sinks. Like the velocity of the money in the real economy, so to speak, stops being used in as many places as as a store of value. You now have this synthetic money which is taking its place and is representing a yield in something like Anchor, which is far better than the banks can compete with. And that may present a problem for the nation states. Like, I suppose I don't really have a particular question on that, but like, is that the same way you think about the problems of these systems, or the potential like points in which there is going to be disagreement between governments and people who want to use these protocols, for example?
Yeah. So, the overarching thesis behind, fiat money is the story of violence. Right. So I have this violence. So I'm going to compel you to spend your money in XYZ ways.
Right.
So the entire reason why the government needs to think about breakage, and it is indeed breakage, right? Like really, like the government places rules around how you can spend your money, not because it's worried about terrorism, not because it's worried about, anything. The reason why governments have capital controls, monetary policy, KYC, ML rules, and the ability to licensure, financial organizations is because they're essentially running an under collateralized points business, right? And they use violence to prevent others from sort of infringing on their business model.
Right.
The antithesis that we're trying to bring forward with Terra is a protest against that violence, right? So if you like really understand how the Korean won works, they have a 4x buffer that is designed to manipulate the currency peg between the Korean won and the USD.
Right.
Most governments do this. They place restrictions around high net worth individuals from the ability to move foreign currency by making each case approvable by BOK, and they don't need to produce a reason why they reject it. So the entire narrative of the Korean won, for instance, is that of theft. And the same could be said for the Thai baht. The same could be said for most currencies that have capital controls. So, I think ultimately, I'm not going to try to come up with like a bullshit narrative as how we're going to sort of, play harmoniously with the existing fiat system. I claim that the thesis of fiat money is violence, and our thesis is a protest against that violence.
It's interesting. All right, so I'm going to play devil's advocate against that argument. I like the argument, and also like I know a lot less about Korea than you do, obviously. But here's the narrative that as I understand it from the point of view of the Korean government's argument, right? Which is, Korea was a country that needed to rapidly increase the economic advantage it had in terms of the type of goods and services it produced. At one time, it was not producing very competitive goods and services globally, and it wanted to revolutionize its economy. One way it did that was by creating capital controls to ensure that the exchange rate meant that that the exports were competitive on the global market. Competitive exports means that you have a balance of payment surplus, which means that the government is able to increase its reserves. So from the point of view of improving the lot of the citizens, being able to invest in infrastructure, and fundamentally being able to educate its populace, this created the first part of the Korean economic story. The second was having niche internal industries which were protected. So shipbuilding was one of them, electronics was another, and it enabled them to fundamentally get to the point where they were protected from global competition up to the point that they were able to be competitive with it. And now what you see is the results of that. Yes, there are the Korean chaebols in the shape of things like LG and Samsung, but Korea is also one of the world leaders in terms of shipbuilding. It's one of the world leaders in terms of electronics, and is actually able to compete on a global stage and still retains a capital account surplus, which means that the population, its populace, is more wealthy than it would have been otherwise. So from a point of view of theft, there is an argument, and I'm not necessarily coming here and saying that I agree with all of this, but I just wanted to present the devil's advocate opposite view of what you've just said.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. But the thing is, if that was true, capital controls should have ceased when we became, like a top 11, top 12 economy in the world, right? But every year, these things get stronger. And I'm not sort of making an argument isolated to Korea. I'm just talking about the dynamic of monetary policies of nation states, whereby the only way that you can try to get a country to scale back regulations in financial markets is by using or leading into a stronger source of violence, which is the United States. Right? In no other case would a nation state voluntarily scale back its financial regulations, because it's really hard to create economic incentives by maximizing breakage and then creating and then sort of scaling back the rules by which that breakage would be reduced, because that creates more economic volatility.
Can you just explain what you mean by breakage a little bit more?
Sure. So basically, if you allow the private citizens to be able to send money freely offshore, so reduce the reporting guidelines, increase the caps by which people can send money, it sort of creates a larger set of adversaries that the currency manipulators of central banks have to trade against, right? So you need a bigger budget in the Forex reserve to be able to maintain pegs, and you will likely lose if you have the entire populace trading against you. It also makes other local regulation less effective because, for example, if you try to increase taxes on domestic equity markets, for instance, or domestic real estate markets, the capital will just fly to different markets where the economic terms are more attractive. And if all the citizens are actively trading against you, even if you're the government, you'll likely lose.
Right.
So it's very hard for the government to actively choose to do that. And let's say, knowing the full economic damages that might be incurred in a 4-year or 5-year presidential term, right? Even if that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it happened in the UK, right? Like Black Monday, we tried to keep the sterling peg, currency peg, and George Soros broke it, and it almost broke the bank in terms of our gold reserves. There are great examples of it, and short-term pain, but long-term, it made UK more competitive globally. So I agree with you. I think that the short-termism of politicians is certainly a massive problem in the world in general, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff. I'm just going to go through some of the questions that we have from the community. So first question is, what is the regulatory future for stablecoins? This was specifically in the context of things like FATFA and VASPs and things like that that's sort of coming out the US. How do you think about regulation of stablecoins?
Yeah, as I sort of posited a thesis against violence, I cannot say things that are too much favorable to that. All I'm going to say is, we're going to do everything that's possible to try to create as much value to users to as many people as possible. And if, going down the compliance route makes sense in that angle, then we'll aim to do that. But Terra's goal, eventually is to disappear, and this will be fully decentralized. And essentially, the only thing that sort of keeps us up at night and motivates us to work hard is because we believe in a more decentralized future where government's violence over currency is less than it is today.
Great answer. The UST peg system with Anchor has been great to get a 20% interest on a stable coin. I'm not sure that's quite correctly worded, but what the question is what is the biggest risk with the Anchor platform? There's a 20% fixed rate of interest. Where's the breaking points there? What's the risk inherent in that?
So Anchor is a lending market where we have cash flow positive assets from multiple different POS chains generating the yield on stablecoin deposits. So right now, the inherent risk, given that Luna is the only asset that's enabled, that a network security threat to the underlying Terra blockchain could upend the entire Anchor system. But people know this already. Given that it's built on the Terra blockchain, if it breaks, then Anchor's probably going to break. But the problem here is that as we start to add more assets, let's say, we're going to be adding Solana, Polkadot, Cosmos Atom, like staking derivatives on Ethereum, as well as many large POS chains. We're going to enter into a scenario where we start to enter the long tail of assets, right? So adding smaller cap proof of stake chains. So what this does is that if any of the underlying POS chains breaks, then it sort of risks the principal protection of the underlying anchor deposits. And this is, a big problem. And a lot of different lending markets have had similar problems. So like Compound had a similar issue with BAT when the BAT price was being manipulated to borrow lots of stablecoins and then to manipulate the farming mechanism. And then Cream had like a similar blowout system where FTX convinced the Cream guys to add FTT as a collateral type. FTT price was manipulated, lots of stablecoins were borrowed, and then this happens a lot. I suspect we'll have to get to a system where we're very conservative on listing assets. Mm-hmm. So we'll start to look at things like the decentralization of stakes mm-hmm. that people have in networks. Mm-hmm. What is the distribution mm-hmm. of the different holders of networks? So and how often does chain work? Are there any history of network security faults or things like that? And be very conservative as we're adding new assets. I think that's the only way to guarantee to not blow up the risk underlying the anchor system.
And I presume that if the anchor system is wildly successful from the point of view of deposits, you may end up in a situation where the 20% is no longer feasible to offer as a return, in that the return that comes from the cashing out of the returns from proof of stake don't cover the ability to create yield. Is that something that, like, how successful from here do you need to be for that to be at risk?
Well, so Anchor needs to be so successful that it needs to start to influence the monetary policies of underlying chains. Mm-hmm. So it's not there yet. Right now, like even just on the Terra network, there's about like $1 billion in TVL in Anchor, mm-hmm. And then it's it's a large portion of the overall network value. But given that Luna is at fully diluted, maybe 17, 18 bill. Something like that. Yes. It's not like enough to influence the overall network. But as we start to add in different assets and Anchor's AUM grows, and proof of stake chains staking rewards start to come down as a result, that's the point in which Anchor rewards are going to diminish. And I think that's a positive thing, right? Because there's no risk-free capital that starts to give you 20% yield, right? That's going to diminish at some point. But the point is that it would never be artificially manipulated in order to incentivize consumers to spend such that the economy can grow. So it's never going to be, manipulated like the federal funds.
Right. And the yield is fundamentally from useful work. Like, you are providing security to a network that is actually providing economic benefit, which is why there isn't a yield rate on it in the first place. So I think it's a great system. What's your opinion of Tether?
So I'm actually a fan. So I think Tether is actually one of the greatest products to come out of crypto. By any measurable metric, it's found one of the strongest product market fits. It's navigated the regulatory landscape extremely well. Like the fact that Bitfinex or Tether hasn't gotten shut down to this day, like there's mastery in operations that need to have that happen for that to take place. And it's something that we look at and are quite honestly, like in awe of, right? So if Tether hadn't existed, crypto would look a lot different today than it does. I think, although I think the failure points for centralized stablecoins is a little bit different from decentralized stablecoins. So I think, over time, there will be reasons to prefer decentralized stablecoins over centralized stablecoins. Once you have a couple of happenings that highlight to the user base why decentralization matters, then I think you're going to see sort of reconstitution of liquidity in decentralized exchanges, and then also centralized exchanges as well that slowly start to trend the movement of funds to the decentralized world.
What's the basis for that belief?
The risks are cliffed if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So with decentralized stablecoins, like it's generally been hard to maintain pegs, even for short periods of time, which is why like over the last year, I think there's been like 50 algorithmic stablecoins that came out, and everything except maybe 3 or 4 have completely gone bankrupt.
Yep.
With centralized stablecoins, it's easier to do that because you explicitly hire market makers and you have forex reserves to be able to maintain pegs.
Right.
But it's also very easy for that underlying pool of capital to be censored,
Right.
or for the centralized company to be shut down for a way. So all it takes is maybe like a smart contract bug, or let's say like the minting key to be stolen in order for the whole system to fail. So the risks are quite binary. In normal conditions, everything's fine. But if there's like a couple of people get arrested or like some keys get stolen, then everything goes to bust.
Yep.
I really hope that doesn't happen, because it's going to be a very painful day for crypto when it does. But it just takes a couple of events like this for people to realize the value of decentralization. And then you can honestly do more things on top of decentralized stablecoins that you can't do on top of centralized ones. So I think once those theses start to play out, you're going to see a lot more movement of liquidity.
Would you feel comfortable holding, or do you hold 100% of your assets in crypto?
Oh yeah, pretty close. Yeah.
And when did you make that transition?
Well, so like when I started Terra, I didn't really have that much assets to speak up. And like even now, I don't really have that much assets. Like I own a bike, and I own pretty nice headphones. And I own like nice laptops. But like that's it. I'm like 29 years old. So like I don't like, I'm not like all that. So it hasn't been like a conscious decision for me. It's just, sort of happened by being in crypto for a lot of my sort of professional career. It's just making things very easy.
Awesome. Last question. If you had 1 minute of global airtime, so an opportunity to speak to everyone in the world for 1 minute, what would you say in that minute?
Ooh, this is a really good question. I've never thought about this. I'd probably spend that minute talking about Anchor Protocol, because I think one of the things that people don't realize right now is how what the short end of the stick that they're getting with their banks forced paying you nothing, or in some cases asking you to pay to borrow your money and to spend it on random stuff, right? So I absolutely doesn't make sense. So I think I would want to paint a future where really, look, these POS chains are sort of like decentralized versions of the Federal Reserve. And while the Federal Reserve treats you like gerbils, like trying to get you to spend your money in their little economic games, according to theories, like you have an unbiased, unpoliticized source of yield that pays you fairly for the risk that you take to lend your money to other people. And it's secured by the beauty of mathematics.
Secured by the beauty of incentivized game theory.
Right.
Cool. Well, it's such a pleasure talking with you. If people want to sort of find out more about Terra, about Luna, about any of the projects, where is the best place to get started? And if they want to follow yourself, like where do you spend most of your time hanging out?
Yeah, so our website, Terra the Money, has access to a lot of really interesting resources, like our white paper or our ecosystem app, where you can see the different projects that are launching on top of Terra. You can also reach me on Twitter. I post quite frequently, and I'm not that hard to find, Do Kwon. So it's looking forward to staying connected, and it's see you guys around.
Thank you very much.